Our guest speaker today is Corinne Marz. She is a historian, a researcher, an author, and a consultant on the Dakota War. She is a graduate of Dr. Martin Luther College in New Ulm, and she is the author of the Dakota Internment Camp at Fort Snelling, Alexander Ramsey's Words of War, and The Day Before the Dakota War. She has also contributed articles to Minnesota's Heritage, Back to the Sources. Her presentation today will be on Lake Shetek and the Aaron Meyer family and Alexander Ramsey's Words of War. Please welcome Corinne Marz.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, Darla and Kathleen. First of all, thank you all for coming today to this program. And thank you to all of our friends who are members or will be becoming members of Brown County Historical Society. And also we want to thank the wonderful staff here at Turner Hall for preparing everything for us today and for making us so welcome. Today there will be two vignettes. The first one is on Aaron Myers and his neighbors as they escaped from Lake Shetek. And then the second one will be, as Darla has said, Alexander Ramsey's Words of War. The Aaron Myers and his neighbors' escape from Lake Shetek will be showing some of the narratives that are now available online and easily available online for all of us to read and learn more about. I found three narratives that Aaron Myers had written and one by one of his neighbors, Charlie Hatch. Now, from the Lake Shetek settlement, there were many narratives written about the experiences and hardships and the sufferings that they went through. And in fact, Brown County Historical Society holds one of these that is published. There is a book by Dr. John Ish from MLC, and he produced and wrote a book on Lavanya Eastlick, one of the survivors. There, for the Alexander Ramsey Words of War portion, I used materials from the Alexander Ramsey papers at the Minnesota Historical Society, including his records and some of his diaries, and you'll see those photographed as slides. I also included in my research materials a portion of an article written by his daughter, Marion Ramsey Furness, Childhood Recollections of Old St. Paul, plus newspaper references, and then you'll also see photographs and other images. You know, we use these narratives and these documents to verify the history that we talk about, because we work in the field of nonfiction. We do not make things up. We go and hunt and try to discover things, to discover and learn what the history actually was all about and what happened. And so it's not for us to be overly creative and make up stories. Our purpose is simply to report and to share. So today, August 19th, 2021, is the 159th anniversary of the First Battle of New Ulm. The second battle occurred just a few days later on August 23rd. During those two events, we know that the barricades were set up just down the street from here, closing off Minnesota Street at Center, and then up to about where Wells Fargo is today. There were about 2,000 refugees, plus the defenders who were inside this 3-block-long enclosure where they were safe. There were other defenders too. There were men at the windmill which from our orientation here was just across the street and up at Center Street. It was a large windmill. And then also the Forester Building, which is a white stucco building down on Broadway, which is still here that you can visit. And then, of course, this Turner Hall building. Now, by the Second Battle of New Ulm, this building was gone. It had been burned by the Dakota. But I believe if you go through the entry into where the restaurant is, in the northwest corner, the back northwest corner, one of those corners might still be original, the basement section. And as you know, with thanks to Dakota War scholar Kurt Dahlin, that these two attacks here in New Ulm were the two largest attacks on any town by any group or band of Indians, and that the evacuation that was organized by Colonel Flandreau on August 25th was also the largest such evacuation of any town. So both these attacks and evacuations were massive undertakings and significant historical events in the entire state of Minnesota's history. Also, the number of killed throughout this entire war, whether 600, 650 or more, were the largest number of civilians killed in such an action ever since the American Revolution, and that remained true until the tragic events of 9/11. The Dakota had a goal, which was to remove all the settlers and their supporters and to restore life as they had remembered it before their lands were ceded and sold. And so the attacks at the Lake Shetek settlement were just one portion of this effort to clear all of Minnesota of the settlers and the way of life that they had brought. So during the afternoon of August 19th, 1862, during the first attack on this city and other places throughout Minnesota, Aaron Meyer, his wife, his children, and his neighbors were enjoying the final day of a life that they had come to love. They had no idea that by that time of day that over 200 settlers and their families living east of their settlement had been killed. And this was going from Acton to Milford, Beaver Creek, and to the agencies. The attacks spread everywhere and to anywhere where there were homes and farms, settlements and towns. So today, on the right-hand side, you'll see a large map of Lake Shetek, and then also adjacent to Lake Shetek at the very top, Bloody Lake. And this is where the 9 families, plus a number of their hired hands, lived. We're looking at probably about a good mile or maybe even close to 2 miles between the southernmost family's cabin, the Wright cabin, all the way up to the very far north, which was the Meyer Cabin. Now, the family spelling here of Meyer is M-E-Y-E-R, but Aaron Meyer actually spelled his name M-Y-E-R. So we accept both, but he used M-Y-E-R. Right now, there is only one cabin remaining, and that is the Caulk cabin. Now, this cabin that you see pictured here is an older image from about 1905 or 1907. And it is no longer at its original location, but it is down at the very southern end of Lake Shetek where the Wright cabin is now. It was moved there in 1961. All of the other cabins have disappeared, and they're merely depressions in the ground. So if you travel out there and you are able to hunt up where these cabins were, you'll see a sign like this one for the herd
I have a
cabin.
question.
Yes,
I'm
ma'am.
not from the area, but where is Lake Shetek from here?
Lake Shetek is 75 miles west of here.
Thank you.
Almost, well, it's in Murray County, so pretty far west.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. And so there were about 45 people in the community at that time. And by the end of August 20th, many would be wounded. In fact, the majority of them would be wounded. Many would have been taken captive, and many would be dead. But what is so incredible is that anyone at all survived from the Lake Shetek community. So many died at Milford, which was so close to New Ulm, but the difficulty there was they were so close to the lower agency and the Redwood Agency. And so from August 18th, 1862, the attack spread out from the Redwood Agency and outward to all areas where settlers lived. So how did the Meyers manage to escape? It was primarily a matter of timing. Where their cabin was located in relation to all of their neighbors, the routes they took, where they hid, the assistance that they received, which was very little, and providence. So now Aaron Meyer was not a physician, but he was an herbalist, and his knowledge of how plants could be used as medicines helped his own neighbors, and it also helped his Dakota neighbors. Although he stated in one of his narratives that he never set a bone, a Dakota woman came to him for help, and he and his wife removed buckshot from her back and legs. And the situation that may have helped him the most was when he used various herbs to soothe and cure eye infections which many of the Dakota had suffered. So on August 20th, 1862, when the violence started throughout the settlement, Myers and his family were only harassed and were not killed. So about 6 a.m. on August 20th, the Myers' oldest daughter heard noise out in their cornfield. Mr. Myers went outside their house to see a band of Dakota on horseback in their field, trampling down their crops. He shouted at them to stop it. And he was told, according to one of the narratives, that he should go inside and have breakfast, and he would feel better. In another, he was told to leave, to get away, and he did just as he was told. He told his oldest son, Arthur, to go and get their teams of oxen, which were just a little way off grazing. The young boy found the pair, but he stopped at the herd cabin, just a little bit south of where they lived, to see if there was any news, because there were no breaking news reports. You found out the news as you experienced it. The boy rushed back, telling him that the herd cabin was empty, plundered, that Mrs. Hurd and her infant and toddler were gone, but that her hired man, Mr. Voigt, was dead and had been shot. With that news, Myers ran to the Caulk cabin and found Mr. Caulk's guard dog still chained but shot dead. And then he found Mr. Caulk, shot in the back and dead, lying on his face in his backyard, holding a water bucket out the side of him. The Dakota had asked him for water, and he took a bucket and was going out to his well when he was shot. With 2 settlers shot dead, Myers ran home. He partially filled his own wagon with hay, hitched up his oxen, put some quilts and blankets in the bed, took some food and water, gently placed his very sick wife in the back and his little children with her, and headed north. He did not take the route down through where you see the red star. That was where the main road went through to the east. He did not take that route. He headed north, and he wrote that he decided to avoid any roads on that main trail, traveling almost 12 miles north before heading east. His entire focus was to protect his wife and children, and everything he did for the next 5 days did just that. By early evening, Myers had turned east onto the Lake Shetek Trail and arrived at what was called Dutch Charlie's shanty or cabin, which was about 18 miles east of Lake Shetek. His name was actually Carl Zierke, but everyone in the community called him Dutch Charlie. And this route went directly from Sioux Falls, Dakota Territory, to here in New Ulm, and it was the postal route. And the postmaster went back and forth with mail as it was available. So now if you're familiar with that part of, I believe it's in Cottonwood County, you'll see that there is the old Westbrook Lutheran Church. And the sign and the church are almost right across from each other. The sign is on the north part of County Road 10, and the church is on the southern part. So Myers got his family settled, and by this time the fighting was all done at Shetek. So about 10 p.m., the Myers farmhand, Edgar Bentley, arrived with Charlie Hatch and a severely injured Mr. Everts, another neighbor. In his narrative, Charlie Hatch noted that a severe thunderstorm had struck that evening and it had poured hard all night. And as he noted, that the storm and the rain was washing their undressed wounds. So they were severely injured. Bentley had been shot in the forearm, Hatch in the wrist, and Everett was the worst injured of all of them. He could hardly move, having been pulled along by his two neighbors. He was shot in the ankle, in the forearm, his elbow was shattered, and he also had a ball in his hip. So Myers dressed all of their wounds, and the men took turns guarding during the night. On the morning of August 21st, Myers made a breakfast for everyone, loaded up the wagon for the next leg of their journey, their escape to Leavenworth. In Brown County, about a day's journey. And so finally, by early evening, they arrived in Leavenworth. And even today, it's a very small town. If you stand at the main intersection, on one side you can see the church and the ball field, and on the other it's open field, and then across the river is just open fields and farms. So it's really possible to see everything nowadays from that intersection, and if you look in 3/4 of a mile in any direction. But Aaron Myers noted that there were 3 houses in town, and he provided the names of 2 of the owners. One belonged to the Kelly brothers, and the other to the Brinks family. So Aaron noted that they drove to the rear of Brink's house and unloaded everything inside. Charlie Hatch commented that it was then that they heard the booming of the cannons at Fort Ridgely, quite a few miles away. And it was at that time that the group of men realized, and as Charlie Hatch said, then and not until then did we know that it was a general war with the Indians. They thought at that time that it was just a localized attack on them and their community. Because his little 15-month-old daughter was fretting, Mr. Myers walked out to the adjacent fenced pasture where Brinks had a few cattle, and he began milking one. Just then his son Arthur ran up to him and said, "Pa, I hear somebody talking down towards the river." And Myers said, "I looked up and I saw 2 teams coming up the road. I listened and saw that they were Indians, 9 in one team and 7 in the other. I shoved the pail through the fence and crawled through myself. It was a rail fence with a heavy growth of wild sunflowers. These sunflowers are called Maximilian sunflowers, and they grow literally like weeds. They're spectacular. They can be 6 to 8 feet long, and they'll literally fill up a field if they're given the chance. So the Indians came up to where I was lying and stopped, and 2 of them jumped out of each wagon. At first I feared that they had seen me. 2 of them jumped over the fence on either side of me, took out their knives, and each cut an armful of corn for their teams, threw it on the wagon, and drove over to Kelly's house. I crawled out through the cornfield to the back side of the house where my folk were, and I took my wife, with the rest following, out back into a little jack oak grove about 250 feet from where the house stood. Then I carried the bedding and the other stuff out there, put all my folks to bed on a cold lunch, and all rested. All was still at Kelly's house, but there was still a bright light, and I crawled out to the corn and crossed the road. I crawled up to the back window of Kelly's house, the sash being broken out. I listened and watched. There were 2 of them down in the cellar, handing up pork to 2 others that were on the floor. Some more were upstairs getting flour. While listening to their talk, I learned that the country between us and town in New Ulm were alive with Indians, getting supplies for the warriors. I crawled back to my family, and about midnight they came out and shot a 2-year-old heifer to eat. Charlie wrote, "We could hear their shouts and whoops until about 3 o'clock in the morning. Most of their dogs were barking most of the night also. We felt greatly relieved when we heard them leaving, going in the direction of the fort. It had been a very anxious time for us, so near the Indians, and Meyer's little babe had cried most of the night, but the Indians made so much noise themselves they did not hear it. We concluded after this to keep away from the main traveled roads. We traveled all the next day in the direction of New Ulm, and toward night we could see a heavy smoke where the town should be, and concluded that the Indians were burning the town." So Meyer said the next day that they traveled all day, and about noon, and this is on the 22nd, we saw some Indians driving Dutch Charlie's team and cattle away. But within about 12 miles of New Ulm, the cattle, or the oxen, gave out. One of them just laid down and wouldn't go any farther. So Meyer said he took the yoke off and drew the load down into a little depression, into a little white ash grove. We talked the matter over and concluded that I'd better go to New Ulm for help. I baked enough bread to last until I could get back. And he had told Charlie Hatch and Edgar Bentley that to give him 24 hours. If he was not back, that they should head for Mankato. And that's eventually what they would end up doing. In the morning, as soon as it was light, on August 23rd, Myers wrote, I started and went straight across the country, passing several houses. I hastened on, had to swim the big Cottonwood River, but got across all right. I went through the timber on the bluffs back of New Ulm, and from there I saw some buildings burning and a large body of Indians making for New Ulm. I went across the road and stood on a large mound looking at them. I was about a quarter of a mile from them when I heard some yells behind me. On looking around, I saw 75 Indians, or about 75 Indians, not more than less than 1,000 feet off, coming out of the ravine. 2 of them started for me, and I ran. Just as I got running, 2 shots were fired, and were rather too close. Being sheltered by the timber, I succeeded in gaining the pickets. So those were the outlining guards for the town. They drove the pickets into the town, and in less than 10 minutes, the town was surrounded by the Indians, and there was no way for me to get back to my family and the wounded men. I was compelled to stay in town. The citizens and the people from the surrounding country all got into the business part of town and had barricaded it the best they could with loose material. But the Indians killed and wounded a great many. There was a common inside of the town which was packed full of horses and wagons and oxen, and the people were in as much danger from these as from the Indians, as they all stampeded when the attack was made and went up Main Street, in many cases taking the wagons with them. The dogs partook of this pandemonium, biting everything they came within reach of. Men were detailed to go through town and shoot all the hogs. Here was the best chance to see the different temperaments of the human race. And so at this time, Colonel Flandreau asked Aaron Myers if he would help supply ammunition for the windmill, which was right up here on the corner. Aaron Myers called it the Grist Mill, on a bench of land running parallel to the town and just in back of the town. It was holding about 30 sharpshooters, about 30 men, and who, as Myers stated, had the best guns. Myers said he ran back and forth with peck baskets filled with bullets and was shot at continually. And at dark, he said, the Indians stopped firing, except for a single shot now and then. And so we know that Aaron Myers was here during that second battle of New Ulm. The next morning, on the 24th, he and a Mr. Tuttle and a Mr. Wright, the husband of captive Julia Wright at Lake Shetek, were sent northeast of the town to fire some buildings which the Indians had been using to shoot at them. We got part of the way, but the Indians saw us and cut us off. We made for a little ravine running into the river. We got there and finally made it across. The Indians fired at us from the big mound on the other side of the big slough. The balls hit the bank over us. We crawled up the ridge and watched the Indians until they went back. We got up in the timber and laid there until about 10 o'clock when we started for St. Peter. We finally struck the road running from Fort Ridgely to St. Peter, which is Highway 5, the old Fort Road, and went on as far as Swan Lake. There was a band of Indians just ahead of us burning the settlers' houses. So we got into a slough west of the settlement, and in going so far to avoid the Indians, we got stuck there below St. Peter. Here, John Wright gave out and said he could go no further. So Aaron Myers was going to go into town and find someone with a team to help them transport Mr. Tuttle and Mr. Wright into town. Just then they saw two wagons, and they were both from Fort Ridgely. And they went back and they picked up the men and got them into town. The committee in St. Peter was looking after the comfort of refugees, and they took us into a hotel and ordered supper for us. News soon spread about our arrival, and Mrs. Lamb, the woman who had been boarding my oldest daughter, Olive, while she was away at school, had come into St. Peter just the previous Wednesday, bringing my daughter with her. Hearing on our arrival from one of their old neighbors who was in St. Peter, Watson Smith, who had deserted his wife at Slaughter Slough, and one of the last things some of the other escapees heard was his wife, Sophia Smith, calling to him and begging him not to abandon her. The Lamb family found him, and he said, "I hardly know who was the most pleased, myself or my girl, at our meeting. They had supposed that we were all dead, as that was the news that Smith had brought in. They finally got a pass to Mankato, and then Aaron Myers found his family there. They had brought in by a small detail headed by Colonel Jerome Dane from South Bend. Aaron Myers said that he had found his wife, and my wife was unconscious in the hospital and died the next morning at 3 o'clock. And she was buried in the cemetery at Mankato." And I talked to Kurt Darlene because he has spent years looking for all of the marked graves of those victims of the Dakota War. And he said that hers is one of the 400 or more unmarked graves. And when Mr. Myers got into St. Peter, this is one of the things he would have seen. This photograph is from 1903, and it is at the top, or the bluff, running along the hilltop in St. Peter. This was the defensive units that the men of St. Peter had set up. You'll see the tree in the middle, And then there's a little darker ridge, and they had dug out a whole dugout there of places for fighters to slide into and hide. And so then they could put their guns just at the top of the ridge and fire at the Indians if they would be attacked. And then in Mankato, these are some of the oldest photographs of old Mankato. And all of the hotels in Mankato at the time were converted into hospitals, and certainly this one was too. And so then our next story, Alexander Ramsey's Words of War. So I believe that Alexander Ramsey's Words of War are the best known phrase or sentence ever stated by any governor of Minnesota. And I know that you have heard it. These words were actually included in a proclamation delivered at the state capitol on September 9th, 1862, where the entire proclamation, intact and whole, has nearly been forgotten. The demand contained within it has been remembered. And these are harsh words. And the demand, which is just a handful of words, is what's remembered. But this is the entire printout of Alexander Ramsey's proclamation from September 9th, 1862. The demand was, as clearly says, the Sioux Indians of Minnesota must be exterminated or driven forever beyond the state, beyond the borders of the state. And this statement has come to exist as an entity really by itself and makes for quite an unforgettable soundbite. And there is no context here, so we don't really know what the rest of the document was. And because this is the only proclamation or section of this proclamation that we hear, we might think that this was the complete and total message. This proclamation, as I said, was delivered on September 9th, 1862 at the state capitol as an update to the ongoing attacks and battles with the Dakota, or the Sioux on the western frontier. Within the timeline of the war, this proclamation was delivered in the middle of this war, almost directly in the middle between August 17th with the attacks at the Acton Township through the battle at Wood Lake on September 23rd, 1862. On August 19th, when Governor Ramsey received the first reports of the attacks on settlements and citizens in western Minnesota, he must have been stunned and just in a state of belief, thinking, how could this be happening? Because not only was his brother, this is a picture of his brother Justice and a picture of Fort Ridgely, but Justice was with 4 other men delivering the 1862 annuity gold payment, and they were now at Fort Ridgely defending it with the other defenders there, the handful of men. And just in the previous year, in 1861, his wife, Anna, his daughter, most of the legislature, reporters, and even tourists as far away from Dubuque and Davenport took 2 riverboats, the Franklin Steele and the Favorite, to the lower agency to see the annual disbursement of the Sioux annuity funds. And so here they had all gone, and here is his a small collection of his diary reports where he talks about leaving. He talks about hearing the young Reverend John Williamson preach, and then his return to the Capitol the next week. And this is a picture of the legislature, a number of the members who journeyed with him. So he's in the center. The Lieutenant Governor, Ignatius Donnelly, is at the very top, about at the, and I know you won't be able to see it, but just above where on the far left, where the magnolia leaves end, is a picture of Senator James Lind, and he would be the very first person killed at the lower agency on the 18th. And then down at the near bottom of this image, on the left side, was the Indian agent, Thomas Galbraith. So the reason for this trip was it had been 10 years since the 1851 treaties at Traverse des Sioux and Mendota had been signed. And there had been years of infrastructure poured into the lower agency, the Redwood, and the upper agency, the Yellow Medicine. There had been businesses built, roads, housing, schools, churches. There were boarding houses, and many houses, 30 to 40 houses for Dakota had been built in both wood and in brick. And so people wanted to see the changes in this community because this community, these two agencies with 7,000 people, was the largest, one of the largest areas built up in Minnesota. It was becoming a center of commerce. And all of the towns here along the Minnesota River, whether it is New Ulm or Mankato, even Henderson and St. Peter, every one of those towns built a road to either Fort Ridgely or to one of the agencies so they could do business and have a direct link out to the western Minnesota area. So after the report on August 19th, Governor Ramsey was told that there were as many as 500 killed with captives taken. And now everyone knew in Minnesota when they were at St. Anthony, or if they were at Winona, or if they were at St. Paul, that anyone east of St. Cloud, Belle Plaine, and Chaska were really on their own. They had to care for their own defense. And I think that when Governor Ramsey visited Henry Sibley at his home in Mendota, that was on his mind and heart when he told Sibley that he had to stop the hostilities and that Sibley had to rescue the captives. But actually, as late as September 9th, when Ramsey gave this proclamation, delivered this proclamation, Sibley and all of the troops and militias had absolutely no capability of carrying out and stopping the fighting or rescuing any of the captives. The Dakota moved at will. They attacked where they pleased. And now Chief Little Crow might have known in his heart of hearts that their dominance was only for a little while, but until Wood Lake, when he found out that it had ended, he hoped that his dominance would last just a little longer. And during the week preceding the proclamation, there were a series of attacks and battles throughout western Minnesota, proving that the Dakota Indians were in charge and controlled the western frontier and southwestern Minnesota. The Battle of Birch Coulee, September 2nd and 3rd, 1862 in Renville County, and in Acton on September 3rd occurred. At Birch Coulee, 14 soldiers were killed, 26 wounded, and 90 horses were killed, with perhaps 2 Dakota killed and 4 to 6 wounded. And this was all within 20 miles of Fort Ridgely. The Dakota were led by Jerome Big Eagle, Red Legs, and Mankato with about 20 soldiers. And they could, if they had rushed the men, if they had rushed the troops under Captain Anderson and Major Brown, they could have run them over and wiped them out, but they did not do that. The Guard, the Cullen Frontier Guards, a mounted militia, 17 Teamsters driving the wagons, and 20 civilian volunteers looking for their own families were among the 100 to 150 men in this detail. And as I said, it could have been far worse, but it was bad enough. At the Battle of Acton in Meeker County on September 3rd, Captain Richard Strout and about 75 men who were sent out to Meeker County to try to protect any straying settlers that they might find out there, found themselves surrounded. on all sides, and in an 8-mile-long fight, retreating back to Hutchinson. Over 2 hours, they were chased and shot at by Little Crow and his 150 men. There were 3 soldiers killed, 18 wounded, with 9 horses lost, plus a wagon filled with supplies. The Dakota killed or wounded is not known. And again, the results were terrible for Strout and his men. Then on September 4th, the Dakota soldiers attacked both Forest City and Hutchinson in McLeod County. And citizens at both of these towns had constructed stockades preventing destruction. But this proved that the Dakota still controlled western and southern Minnesota. So really it was until the Battle of Wood Lake on September 23rd and the surrendering of the captives on the 26th did the fighting begin. And even then, there were many captives missing. For many of them, it took days or weeks. There were a number of captives, one of the Ingalls girls, who was not returned for over 2 years. And then there were many of them who were never brought back to their families. So we also know that there were raids that continued, at least until May of 1865, with the attack on the Jewett family near Rapidan, near Mankato. So when as familiar as we are with Ramsey's demand, it is also true that it was the Dakota who unilaterally had declared war on Minnesota citizens, and that their purpose, and this is a quote from Chief Jerome Big Eagle, that their plan was to kill all the whites and all the cutheads. So those would have been Indians who supported the whites and coming in and becoming farmers, and kill all the whites and all the cutheads who will not join us, to take their land back and to return to their way of life before the settlers came. The lives of Dakota Indians of mixed descent were also in jeopardy during this time too. The result of this action was that 650 or more civilians were killed, with the goal really of driving them all out. So, and there's one final note about Alexander Ramsey's proclamation, especially his demand, is that his demand was not part of his original proclamation statement. This is the first page of 8 pages. It was all handwritten. He took his buggy from his home over to the Capitol, and you'll see the original old Capitol there at the top of that photograph on the left. And this was when it was still the territory in 1857. But I read through the 8-page document, I don't know how many times, looking for this demand, and just came to realize that it was not in there. It was not part of his original report. So perhaps when he read this detailed report, he knew the catastrophe that these attacks and battles had cost the citizens of Minnesota. So many killed, the farm economy collapsing, 20,000 to 30,000 citizens who fled their homes and property behind, and many of them never to return. Perhaps he believed that the state of Minnesota could not and would not recover if the Dakota remained. And I know that those are very harsh words to read, and I don't know what his reason for inserting that phrase was, but it was done. And once he made this demand, his words were duly noted and captured, and to where this demand is the only part of the proclamation remembered. Thank you. Are there any questions or anything that you'd like to add? Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir.
Corinne?
Yes, Terry.
I got your book, Ramsey's Words of War.
Yes.
Have you personally gotten any crap for that?
No, no. I've actually not received a lot of feedback on it.
I agree with your conclusion, but I just wondered if people kind of attack you for putting that out there.
No, I think when you are looking at all of the data, and as I said, because in history we work in nonfiction, all we do is hunt and find. And sometimes we go into a study of something thinking that we already know what the conclusion is, and we come out with a different answer when we've looked at what the data all says. That little standalone booklet was originally in the first issue of Minnesota's Heritage, Back to the Sources. And hopefully maybe next year I'll have it reprinted, but not yet. So, thank you. Any other questions?
I have a comment.
Yes, ma'am.
I grew up in the area of Lake Shetek, about, maybe 30 miles away, and we frequented quite a bit.
Yes.
And I remember the cabin before it was moved. The door was open, we'd go in and out, and there were like stones for steps to get in. And then one time I was out there and it was gone. So then somebody told me it went to the state park.
Right, it is now in the state park. We were there just a couple of Sundays ago. And there's a large sign in front, and one of the interesting photos that's included, there's a picture of it actually being moved in 1961.
I think I have a picture someplace that I took of it when it was at Tipiota, that's what they call
Correct.
that area.
Yes, yes, and that, it's very good to remember that things don't always stay the same.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so interesting having that sign there in front of the cabin.
Well, at the time, we didn't know anything about it. It was just a log cabin by the lake, and, we would go in and out.
Right, and that was, and maybe because of where it was, is the reason that it survived. We were not able to get up to where the Meyer's cabin was. I mean, it's private property, and the cabin probably is gone. It's from what I understood, that it had been, all of the cabins were gone. And one of the cabins, the right cabin, the one that was the farthest south on Lake Shetek, that had actually been dismantled and removed in the winter of 1880, 1881, the long winter. And the people in Tracy used it as firewood. They chopped it all up. Right. So it served a purpose. It's just sad that it could not survive to this day. And then these three pictures. There's the walkway that you see there is behind where the monument is. It was in October of 1862 that a small group of men, including Dutch Charlie and perhaps William Dooley, but I'm not sure of him, a small group of men came out with a detail of soldiers, and they located the bodies because they were all still there, from August. And as far as I understand, they buried them where they were found. Then maybe the next year or a year after, William Dooley with Dutch Charlie and a number of other people made another trip out a second time, this time with wooden coffins, and they found every single body. And they buried them in a long trench just south of where this middle photo is, in a long trench. The mystery there were 14 dead, and they found 15 bodies. And so, no one knows where this 15th person, the remains, came from. It is possible that it is one of the Indians that was killed, because all of the remaining settlers all moved into the large Wright cabin. There were 34 people in that cabin, plus a team of horses. And they were in there all afternoon, and the cabin had been surrounded, and there was a firefight going on. And those settlers did have guns and fired back. And so it possibly was a Dakota, but no one knows. No one knows. Any other questions? Comments? Yes, sir.
Corinne?
Yes. Oh, yes. How are you? I have to tell you, before Daryl and Diane Sanis, and they are from the Brooklyn Historical Society, and this is the Brooklyn Park and Brooklyn Center Historical Society, and they were the people, the individuals that had this image preserved. This is the Battle of Acton. It also shows where the original attack was at the Anderson Jones and the Howard Baker cabins. And this is the only image of its kind, and they found it and had it conserved, if that's the correct word, preserving it for today. So, yeah, yes, sir.
So in your narrative today, you talked about how Aaron Myers went from his cabin to Mankato.
Yes.
Do we know exactly what happened to his family and how they got there?
Yes, we do. The next day, after 24 hours, when he did not return, they had an agreement with the 3 men that were wounded that they would head for Mankato. And so that's what they did. Charlie Hatch hitched up the oxen, and they went toward Lake Crystal. They were almost to Lake Crystal. And they said it was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and they saw a whole bunch of horses coming. And they thought it was another group of Indians on horseback. And Charlie Hatch said there was nothing that we could do. He said, we thought we would all be dead within minutes. And he said, the 2 of the men, so Bentley and Charlie Hatch, they ran for, there was a slough there, they ran for the slough. 2 of the little children, they got out and they ran for the slough, for the tall grasses. Mr. Everett, he couldn't move, and Mrs. Myers by this time was unconscious. So she and the little toddler stayed in the wagon. Here it was a detail of mounted militia. It was Colonel Dane, Jerome Dane from South Bend. And he said this was the first protection that they had received. And so they took them into Mankato, and then they took them to the hotels, which had been converted into hospitals. And Charlie Hatch said that they received the best care that they could from the doctors and nurses and volunteers that were there. But for Mrs. Myers, there was really nothing to be done for her anymore. I think it was, the combination of the terror of going across the frontier and not knowing what was going to happen next to you. So,
Thank you.
Any other questions today? Yes, Stephanie?
You mentioned Hatch. Is that any relationship to the Hatch's battalion?
I don't believe so. Although Charlie Hatch did enlist in the Civil War, and he served, and then when he came back, he married and had a family. Many of these narratives are from about 1895. There were 2 physicians out in western Minnesota, Dr. Neil Curry, and so Dr. Curry the town is named after him at Lake Shetek. And then Harper Workman, who was another physician, and he was at Sleepy Eye. And so the 2 of these men worked together. They both had an interest in the Dakota War, and it was their interest to talk to the survivors. So they wanted first-person narratives, and this was what they did. This was their hobby. This was a lot like Marion Satterley, people whose interest was in the war, but finding out who survived. So, and I know even Anton Gog did this when he was painting his Battle of New Ulm. He actually went out to the reserve out to the lower agency, and he interviewed quite a number of Dakota men who had participated in the battle here at the first battle and the second battle. And he wanted to know what they wore. He wanted to have a movement of them, you know, for him to show what did they do, an action shot. And after he had finished his painting, it has been said, and I've not seen any of the documents surviving, but that he gave all of these Dakota men a picture of themselves that was seen in the Battle of New Ulm by Anton Gog. So, any more questions? This has been just delightful. Thank you so. Yes.
I just wanted to know, is there a road map or guide that shows all the monuments and all the areas included in the war?
There might still be some remaining. 2 years ago, or maybe 3 years ago, you know, after a while you forget when things are. Kurt Dahlin worked with Mr. David Larson from the Redwood County Historical Society, and they actually produced a book on all of the monuments and all of the sites of the Dakota War. And I would say the book maybe was about $25. But if you would contact the Redwood County Historical Society, and it's possible that Brown County might have some, I don't know. But there is a book, and there is a new book, and anything that's produced by Kurt Dahlin is superb. Yes, Stephanie.
In memorial of yesterday's events, I swung into the Morton, at Renville County Historical Society at Morton, and they had about 3 copies of that U.S. guidebook.
They did?
Our guidebook to the U.S. Dakota War.
At Renville.
That you're speaking of, yes.
Yes. There you go, Renville County. Thank you, Stephanie. Any more questions? Thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Amy Johnson. I'm the program coordinator at the Brown County Historical Society. I just wanted to remind you of the other events that we have coming up yet this week. So tomorrow, Friday, we will have Terry Sweeney speaking here at 12:15. What happened to the animals on the barricades. From 1 to 4, the Kiesling House will be open. That is a $3 admission. Saturday at 2 o'clock, we will have downtown walking tours. If you're interested, we will be meeting at the sign outside of the museum. And also on Saturday from 1 to 4, the Kiesling House will be open again, and the New Ulm Battery will be there.
And what you mentioned, there are postcards that they can have.
And there are postcards here that you can have. And then on Sunday, we are doing a cemetery walking tour. So we'll be meeting out at the cemetery at 2 o'clock by the main building. Also, the book that you guys were referencing as far as the guidebooks, we do have them available in the museum as well. So, thank you so much, everybody, for coming, and maybe we will see you tomorrow. Please let us know if you have any questions. Thank you.